The two men dragged Eliza Bennett across the frozen street, so hard that one of her boots came loose in the snow. She twisted against their grip, but a gloved hand crushed over her mouth before she could scream. At 29, Eliza had never thought knowing how numbers fit together could get a woman killed. Yet beneath her coat, her fingers were clenched around a torn ledger page bearing forged land transfers, and her father's name written beside the date he died. As they shoved her into the waiting wagon, her white handkerchief slipped from her sleeve and disappeared beside the wheel. Somewhere behind those neat columns of ink was the reason her father had gone over a cliff, and Silas Crowe's men were determined to make sure Eliza never told anyone. Hours later, Deputy Wade Harlan pushed her into an abandoned hunting cabin deep among the Rocky Mountain pines. Boards covered the windows. There was an iron stove, 3 pieces of firewood, and no food worth naming. Harlan stood outside the doorway with the easy smile of a man who knew no law in town would trouble him. Stay here until you remember how to keep quiet. Eliza stared at him. And if I don't? His smile disappeared. Then the cold may save us the trouble. The lock snapped shut from outside. By midnight, the fire had shrunk to red coals. Eliza wrapped an old blanket around her shoulders and worked a rusted iron poker against the door until her palms bled. It did not move. Crowe believed she knew where the real company ledger was hidden. He was right. What he did not know was that Eliza had hidden it somewhere even his money might hesitate to search. But as she froze in that cabin, the truth would freeze with her. If you're wondering how much courage matters when a locked door stands between you and morning, Eliza Bennett was about to find out. Several miles away, Caleb Mercer reined his horse beside wagon tracks, crossing a trail nobody had reason to use in winter. The 41-year-old mountain man had spent years teaching himself not to interfere in other people's troubles. Then he saw a woman's handkerchief half buried in the snow. A little farther on were marks no horse had made, the uneven furrows of boots dragged against their owner's will. Caleb's jaw tightened. For one unwanted moment, he remembered another woman he had failed to reach in time, and a little girl whose face still waited inside an old photograph at his cabin. He followed the tracks without another thought. Near dawn, Eliza heard boots outside and forced herself upright. She gripped the iron poker with both hands. Certain Harlan had returned. Then the lock exploded inward under one blow. Cold white light filled the doorway, framing a tall, bearded stranger in worn buckskins with a Winchester across his back. Eliza swung. Caleb caught the poker before it struck his head. "Easy, ma'am." She backed away, terrified. "Who are you?" Caleb glanced at her bleeding hands, the dying stove, then the lock hanging broken from the door. "If I meant you harm, I wouldn't have bothered opening that." He gave her his coat and stepped outside to examine the trail. Eliza followed far enough to see him kneel in the snow. Fresh hoof prints crossed their own tracks. Several riders. Coming fast. Caleb rose, pulled the Winchester from his shoulder, and looked toward the trees. Whoever had locked Eliza inside had already discovered something had gone wrong. Through the pines came the distant sound of horses climbing toward them. Caleb turned to Eliza and held out his hand. "Can you ride?" She nodded. "Then we leave now." Behind them, the hoofbeats grew louder. Caleb did not take the wagon road. He pulled Eliza onto his horse behind him and drove the animal straight into the timber, where snow-covered branches slapped at their shoulders and erased pieces of their trail almost as quickly as they made it. The riders behind them spread out. Caleb could hear it in the changing rhythm of the hoofbeats. They were not searching blindly. They knew these woods well enough to hunt a frightened woman. Eliza held the back of Caleb's coat with numb fingers as he guided the horse toward a narrow cut between two granite walls. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere they won't." A rifle cracked behind them. Bark jumped from a pine beside Caleb's head. He did not look back. The trail dropped toward a frozen creek. Caleb dismounted, tested the ice with the butt of his Winchester, then led the horse across instead of riding it. Eliza followed, her legs shaking from cold and exhaustion. Halfway over, another shot echoed through the trees. Caleb seized her arm and pulled her behind a shelf of rock. "Stay low." He fired once, not at the riders, but into a dead pine leaning above the creek bank. Snow crashed from its branches, scattering across the ice and hiding their tracks beneath a white curtain. Then Caleb led Eliza upstream through shallow drifts until they reached a place where the creek disappeared between steep walls. Only then did he climb back toward the high country. His cabin stood beneath a ridge of dark spruce, nearly invisible until they were within 50 yards of it. Caleb pushed Eliza inside, fed split pine into the iron stove, and put a tin cup of water near the heat. He moved with the practiced economy of a man accustomed to having no one there to help him. Eliza's hands were bleeding from the poker she had used against the locked door. Caleb noticed without comment. He set a basin on the table, tore a clean strip from an old cotton shirt, and nodded toward the chair. "Hands." She hesitated. "I can manage." "I reckon you can." He poured warm water into the basin. "Sit anyway." While Caleb wrapped her palms, Eliza studied the room. Everything had a place. Traps stacked beside one wall, dried meat hanging near the stove, ammunition above a workbench. Then she noticed a small framed photograph on the shelf. A woman sat beside a little girl in a Sunday dress. Caleb followed her eyes and immediately turned the photograph face down. Eliza said nothing. His hand stopped for only a second before finishing the bandage. He placed bread and venison stew before her, then laid his Winchester within reach beside the door. It was not hospitality. It was preparation. "They'll come," Eliza said. Caleb checked the shutter. "How many?" "I don't know." "Who?" She looked into the tin cup. Deputy Harlan was one of them. That made Caleb turn. A hired gun could be avoided. A deputy carried the appearance of law, and men like Crowe had learned that respectable paper could frighten people better than a pistol. Caleb pulled out the chair opposite her. "Start talking." Eliza reached inside her dress and removed a folded ledger page she had protected through the kidnapping. She spread it on the table. Columns of acreage payments and family names covered the paper. Caleb frowned. "Numbers ain't my strong suit." "They don't have to be." Eliza touched one line. "This ranch belonged to a widow named Mrs. Bell. Crowe's company recorded that she sold it willingly. She never did." Her finger moved lower. "This family supposedly transferred 600 acres for $20. They can't even write their names." Then her finger stopped. "And this is my father." Caleb saw the date beside Thomas Bennett's name. "He died that day," Eliza said. "They found him below a cliff 3 days after he told me he discovered something that could destroy Crowe." Caleb's expression hardened. "You think Crowe killed him?" "I think my father found proof that Crowe forged land records, took property from families who couldn't fight him, and paid men to make questions disappear." She folded the page again. "And I think they locked me in that cabin because they believe I found the same proof." A gust struck the cabin. Caleb crossed to the stove, but when he bent for another piece of wood, Eliza heard a faint scrape outside. Caleb froze. His hand moved from the firewood to the Winchester. He extinguished the lamp with 2 fingers and motioned her away from the window. For several seconds, neither moved. Then something touched the door. Caleb opened it suddenly, rifle ready. Nothing stood there. He stepped outside and found a strip of red cloth tied around a low branch beside the porch. Fresh. It had not been there when they arrived. Beneath it, pressed into the snow, was the clean print of a man's boot. Someone had found the cabin. Caleb came back inside and barred the door. "Pack what you can carry." Eliza did not move. "Where are we going?" "Across the range. There's a settlement west of here. I can get you there before Crowe's men close the passes. And then you keep going." Eliza stared at him. "You broke open that door just to tell me to run?" "I broke it because nobody deserves to freeze locked in a box. My father didn't run. And now he's dead." The words landed harder than Caleb intended. Eliza looked away. He regretted them immediately, but apology did not come easily to him. After a moment, she said, "The real ledger still exists." Caleb stopped. What you saw is one page I copied. The original records every false transfer, every payment, every family Crowe cheated. She looked directly at him. I hid it before Harlan took me. Where? In town. Caleb gave a humorless breath. Then leave it there. If I leave, Crowe keeps everything. The Bell Ranch, the Miller land, the miners' wages, whatever else he's stolen. Her voice remained quiet, and my father becomes another man who fell off a cliff. Caleb looked toward the face-down photograph. Eliza noticed. I don't know who they were, she said softly, and I won't ask, but I know what it is to wish you had one more chance to do something before someone is gone. Caleb's jaw tightened. Don't. I wasn't trying to hurt you. No, you're trying to make your fight mine. He lifted the bar from the door and stepped onto the porch. Eliza remained by the stove while Caleb stood outside in the snow. After several minutes, she picked up the photograph and turned it upright. She did not examine it closely. She simply returned it to the way it had been before he hid it. When Caleb came back, he saw what she had done. My wife was Sarah, he said at last. Girl was Annie. Eliza waited. Fire took the cabin while I was 3 days north checking traps. His voice held no drama, because the grief had lived in him too long to need any. By the time I came home, there wasn't anything left to save. I'm sorry. Caleb looked at the photograph. That's why I live up here. So that was his locked room. Eliza understood. No boards over the windows. No iron lock on the door. Just years of making certain nobody could matter enough to be lost again. Before either could speak, a distant sound rolled up from below. Hoofbeats. More than 2 horses this time. Caleb crossed the window and lifted the edge of the shutter. Between the trees far down the slope, lantern light moved against the snow. Eliza stood beside the table. You can still send me away. Caleb took his Winchester from beside the door and checked the chamber. No, he said. Outside, the lanterns began climbing toward the cabin. Caleb killed the stove fire, pulled Eliza away from the window, and watched the lanterns climb through the timber. 4 riders moved below the cabin, but they were following the obvious trail. Caleb had spent 15 winters learning how snow lied to men who did not understand mountains. He opened the rear door. They expect us to run downhill. Eliza tightened her coat. So, where do we go? Caleb nodded toward the black ridge above them. Up. Minutes later, they were leading his horse through a narrow cut hidden behind spruce branches, while Harlan's men closed on an empty cabin. By dawn, the storm had covered most of their tracks. Caleb brought Eliza beneath a granite overhang, where they could rest without showing smoke. She was shivering, but when he offered to take her west again, she shook her head. The ledger is inside the church. Caleb stared at her. You had stolen company records in church. Inside a Bible nobody touches except the pastor. For the first time, something almost like amusement crossed Caleb's face. That's either clever or sacrilegious. Depends who finds it first. Then her expression changed. My father knew Crowe was stealing land. He was going to expose him. 3 days later, he was dead. If I leave now, everything he risked dies with him. Caleb looked across the White Mountains. For years, he had treated distance as protection. Distance from towns. Distance from promises. Distance from anyone whose absence might leave another grave inside him. But Eliza was not asking him to heal. She was asking him not to look away. We'll get your ledger, he said. After that, we do this with proof, not bullets. Eliza studied him. Why did you change your mind? Caleb adjusted the Winchester strap across his shoulder. Because I already know what it costs to come home too late. They reached town after dark the following evening by an old miner's trail. Caleb left his horse behind a shuttered stable and kept to the alleys while Eliza led him toward the church. Even at that hour, Silas Crowe's influence seemed to occupy the street before the man himself appeared. A Crowe mining notice hung in the mercantile window. 2 miners lowered their voices when Harlan crossed the road. A widow hurried past the land office without looking toward it. Crowe had not conquered the town with gunmen alone. He had taught decent people that speaking could cost them their wages, their homes, or their lives. The church side door opened beneath Eliza's hand. Inside, oil lamps had been extinguished, leaving only moonlight through the tall windows. She moved quickly to the front pew, knelt, and reached beneath a worn Bible. Nothing. Her face went pale. Caleb whispered, "What?" "It was here." A match struck behind them. Deputy Wade Harlan stood near the rear doors with a revolver leveled at Caleb. Two armed men stepped from the shadows. Harlan smiled. "Miss Bennett, you always were smarter with numbers than people." Caleb moved slightly in front of her. "Don't," Harlan said. "Crowe wants the woman alive." He said nothing about the mountain man. Eliza's eyes searched the church. Then she saw something Caleb did not. The Bible she had used was now resting on the pulpit instead of the pew. Someone had moved it. Harlan followed her gaze. That single glance betrayed her. "Bring me that Bible," he ordered. One of the gunmen started forward. Caleb moved first. He knocked an oil lamp stand into the aisle and shoved Eliza behind a pew as Harlan fired. The shot tore through Caleb's left shoulder and spun him against a wooden column. Eliza screamed his name. Caleb stayed on his feet long enough to fire into the ceiling. Plaster and dust crashed down, sending the gunman diving for cover. "Back door!" he shouted. Eliza crawled toward him instead. "Go!" Harlan came through the dust. Caleb shoved open a side window, dropped into the snow outside, and disappeared between the buildings before Harlan's men could circle the church. Eliza never reached the window. A hand seized her coat and dragged her backward. By the time the street became quiet again, Caleb was bleeding somewhere in the darkness, and Eliza was back in Harlan's custody. Silas Crowe was waiting in the mining office. He looked nothing like the monster Eliza had imagined while locked in the hunting cabin. His gray suit was clean. His beard was trimmed. The gold watch in his vest could have paid a miner's wages for months. He stood when Harlan brought her in and even pulled out a chair. "Miss Bennett," Crowe said calmly, "this has become unnecessarily unpleasant." Eliza remained standing. Crowe placed a thick ledger on the desk. Her breath caught. "You caused considerable trouble over this." She recognized the binding immediately. Crowe opened it, saw the names and acreage inside, and smiled. "Your father made the same mistake you did. He believed records have power simply because they're true. You killed him." Crowe closed the book. "I did not push Thomas Bennett from any cliff." The careful wording told Eliza more than a confession would have. Crowe leaned back. "Your father threatened livelihoods. This mine feeds half the town. It also steals from the other half. Land changes hands. Not with dead men's signatures." For the first time, Crowe's expression cooled. There was the entire scheme reduced to something simple. Crowe had forged transfers because every stolen ranch gave his mining company more land, timber, water, and access. If the real record became public, families could reclaim what he had taken, and the respectable empire he had built would begin to collapse. Crowe nodded toward Harlan. "Put her in the storage room. Tomorrow morning, a wagon will take her out of Colorado." Eliza looked at the ledger again. Then she smiled. Crowe noticed. Something amusing? No. But the smile remained. Harlan locked her inside the storeroom behind the mining office. This room was smaller than the hunting cabin, with no stove and only a narrow window near the ceiling. Eliza sat against a crate and listened until Harlan's boots disappeared. Crowe believed he had won. He had the woman. He had the ledger. And Caleb Mercer had taken a bullet. There was only one problem. The book on Crowe's desk was a copy. Pastor Whitfield had moved the real ledger before Harlan entered the church, hiding it inside the hollow space behind the pulpit Bible rack. Eliza had seen the slight gap in the wood the moment Harlan struck his match. She had deliberately looked toward the wrong Bible. For the first time since her kidnapping, Crowe was holding exactly what Eliza wanted him to hold. Several streets away, Caleb staggered to the rear door of a widow's house and nearly collapsed onto her kitchen floor. Mrs. Bell recognized him, and then recognized the blood. "You need a doctor." "I need people." Caleb placed one of Eliza's copied land records on her table. Mrs. Bell read her own family name and covered her mouth. Before sunrise, Caleb had gathered a miner Crowe had cheated, Pastor Whitfield, Mrs. Bell, and the mercantile owner in the church basement. His shoulder was bandaged badly enough to show how little time he had wasted. The pastor placed a real ledger on the table. Nobody spoke. They all understood what it could cost to stand beside it. The miner looked toward the door. "Crowe owns the deputy." Mrs. Bell whispered, "He can take everything." Caleb rested his good hand on the table. "He already has." Silence followed. Caleb looked from one frightened face to another. He was not a preacher, and he had never trusted speeches. So he simply pushed Eliza's copied papers into the center of the table. "One woman stood up to him alone," he said. "Question is whether this whole town has enough courage to stand with her." No one answered immediately. That frightened Caleb more than gunfire. Then Mrs. Bell reached forward and placed her hand on the page bearing her stolen ranch. "I'll stand." The miner stepped beside her, then the storekeeper. Pastor Whitfield closed a real ledger and tucked it beneath his coat. Outside, the first gray light touched the street. Across town, Harlan unlocked Eliza's storeroom and pulled her toward the waiting wagon. And for the first time in years, Caleb Mercer walked down from the shadows of the mountains not to escape other people's lives, but to put himself squarely between a frightened town and a man who had taught it to stay silent. Harlan dragged Eliza into the morning street with her wrists bound, and one hand clamped around her arm. A wagon waited in front of the mining office, its rear covered with canvas. Silas Crowe stood on the boardwalk in his dark coat, watching shopkeepers unlock their doors and miners drift toward work. Nobody asked why a young woman was being forced into a wagon. Nobody challenged a deputy, wearing a badge. That silence was the strongest weapon Crowe owned. Eliza searched the street for Caleb and saw nothing. The last image she had of him was his body striking the church column after Harlan's bullet tore through his shoulder. She did not know whether he had survived. Harlan unlocked one wrist, only long enough to fasten the chain to an iron ring inside the wagon. "You should have taken the warning at the cabin," he muttered. Eliza looked past him toward Crowe. "You should have checked the ledger more carefully." Crowe's eyes narrowed. He stepped down, opened the copied book again, and turned several pages. "What did you say?" Eliza gave him no answer. Then a voice came from the far end of the street. "Open that lock." Harlan turned. Caleb Mercer stood alone in the road. His left arm was bound tightly against his body. Blood had seeped through the bandage beneath his coat. His Winchester rested in his right hand, barrel pointed toward the ground. He looked pale enough that Eliza knew every step had cost him something. Harlan laughed. "You got more stubbornness than sense, mountain man." Caleb stopped 20 yards away. Could say the same about a deputy who kidnaps women. Crowe glanced toward the rooftops and alleys, expecting an ambush. "Mr. Mercer, whatever Miss Bennett told you, this is a lawful company matter." Caleb looked at Eliza chained a wagon. Lawful men generally don't lock women in hunting cabins. A few townspeople stopped walking. Crowe noticed. "Harlan," he said quietly, "put her in the wagon." The deputy reached for Eliza. Caleb raised a Winchester, not at Harlan's chest, at the chain. "Don't." Harlan's hand drifted toward his revolver. "You planning to shoot a deputy in the middle of town?" "No." Caleb's voice stayed level. "I'm planning to make you choose in front of everybody." That was when Eliza saw movement behind him. Mrs. Bell stepped from beside the mercantile. Then the miner Crowe had cheated came from the livery. The storekeeper crossed the boardwalk and stood in the road. More followed, men in work coats, women with shawls drawn around their shoulders, laborers whose hands still carried coal dust from the night shift. Caleb had not come alone. The people kept coming until the street behind him was filled. Crowe's confidence did not disappear. Men like him did not survive by surrendering at the first sign of resistance. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. You are interfering with a deputy performing his duty. Miss Bennett stole private company property, attacked lawful officers, and conspired with this man to damage my business. Anyone joining them will answer for it. The crowd shifted. One miner stepped backward, then another. Caleb saw fear moving through them. Old and practiced, Crowe did not need every person to believe him. He only needed them to remember mortgages, wages, hungry children, and what happened to Thomas Bennett. For one terrible moment, the road began opening behind Caleb. Crowe smiled. There, he said, people understand consequences. Harlan drew his revolver. Caleb could not raise the Winchester quickly with one useful arm. Eliza saw Harlan's thumb pull back the hammer. Caleb! The shot cracked. Caleb twisted aside. The bullet struck a hitching rail behind him. Before Harlan could fire again, 3 miners surged forward and seized his gun arm. Harlan struck one across the face and tried to break free, but suddenly he was not facing one wounded mountain man. He was facing men who had spent years swallowing humiliation because they believed they were alone. Enough! Crowe shouted. A church bell rang. Once. Then again. Everyone turned. Pastor Whitfield walked from the church, carrying a large worn Bible against his chest. Crowe's face changed. The pastor stopped beside Caleb and opened the Bible. From behind its leather cover, he removed a thick ledger. Eliza closed her eyes for one brief second. The real one. Crowe looked at the book in his own hands, then at the one held by the pastor. No, he said. Eliza stepped down as one of the women found the wagon key and freed her chain. The one you took was copied, she said. I needed you to believe you'd found it. Crowe recovered quickly. A book proves nothing. She worked in my office. She could have written anything she pleased. Pastor Whitfield opened the ledger. Then perhaps we should read it. Crowe moved toward him. Caleb stepped between them. His wounded shoulder sagged, but he did not move aside. The pastor began with Mrs. Bell's property. The company record claimed she had voluntarily sold her ranch 2 years earlier. Mrs. Bell pushed through the crowd. I never signed any sale. Crowe pointed at the ledger. Her mark is recorded. I don't make a mark. She pulled a church register from beneath the pastor's Bible. Beside her husband's burial entry was her carefully written signature. My husband taught me my letters 30 years ago. A murmur passed through the street. The pastor turned another page. A miner's unpaid wages had been recorded as paid in full. The miner stepped forward and produced the company chit he had kept because Crowe's office had refused to honor it. Another entry transferred land from a rancher on a date when church burial records showed the man had already been dead for 11 days. The lie was beginning to break in small, undeniable pieces. Then Eliza took the ledger. She found her father's name. This entry says Thomas Bennett approved these transfers. Crowe said nothing. Eliza held up the page. The date is the day my father died. Crowe's jaw tightened. Your father worked for me. His name appearing in company records proves nothing. No, Eliza said, but this does. She turned several pages backward and showed the crowd the handwriting. Her father's entries were narrow, precise, always made in dark black ink. On the day of his death, the supposed approval had been written in a broader hand and squeezed between 2 older entries. Eliza had stared at her father's writing since childhood. That isn't his hand. Crowe looked toward Harlan. The deputy saw it. So did Caleb. Crowe was no longer looking at a servant. He was looking for an escape. "Harlan," Crowe said quietly, "bring the horse." The street went still. Harlan stared at him. Crowe's voice sharpened. "Now!" But the deputy's revolver was already in the dirt, and the miners surrounding him did not step aside. "You said nobody would ever question the records," Harlan muttered. Crowe's eyes hardened. "Mind yourself." Harlan looked toward Eliza, then toward the ledger, then at the crowd that had spent years lowering its eyes whenever his badge appeared. His voice failed the first time. Crowe stepped closer. "Wade." The warning in that single word was unmistakable. Harlan nearly bent to pick up his revolver. Then he saw Caleb, bleeding through his bandage, but still standing between Crowe and Eliza. Harlan straightened. He knew Bennett was going to talk. He said. Crowe went pale. "Harlan." "He told me to frighten him." Eliza did not move. Harlan swallowed. "I wasn't there when Bennett went over that cliff, but Crowe sent 2 men after him that evening. Same men he sent to take Miss Bennett." Crowe struck Harlan across the mouth and ran. He made it 6 steps. 2 mine workers blocked the alley. Crowe turned toward the stable. More workers closed that way. He backed into the center of the street and finally understood what had changed. His money was still his. His mine was still standing. His office still contained deeds bearing official seals. But fear no longer belonged only to everyone else. Crowe reached inside his coat. Caleb raised a Winchester. "Don't." Crowe froze. Slowly, he removed his hand, empty. A gray-haired town constable who had remained silent near the courthouse finally stepped forward. He looked at the ledger, at Harlan's discarded weapon, and at the crowd. "Silas Crowe, I'm placing you under arrest pending examination of these records and the death of Thomas Bennett." Crowe laughed bitterly. "On the word of thieves and cowards?" Mrs. Bell answered him. "No, on ours." The constable put irons around Crowe's wrists. By afternoon, the courthouse office was packed. The ledger was placed before the local judge along with church records, wage chits, original signatures, and testimony from families whose land had been taken. Crowe's attorneys argued that the company's stamp deeds were official and that a private ledger could not overturn them. For a while, it seemed the polished documents might still protect him. Then the judge compared the dates. A deed bearing the signature of a dead rancher. A transfer supposedly approved by Thomas Bennett after the hour witnesses had last seen him riding away in fear. Payments recorded as completed when company chits showed the opposite. One contradiction led to another. The judge ordered the disputed transfers frozen, the county records seized for examination, and Crowe held while the land fraud and Thomas Bennett's death were investigated. Harlan surrendered his badge and agreed to testify. It was not a grand verdict delivered in a single afternoon. Truth rarely repaired years of damage that quickly. But Crowe's machine had stopped. In the weeks that followed, forged transfers were uncovered one by one. Families began reclaiming land they had believed lost forever. Miners brought forward wage records. Men who had once crossed the street to avoid Crowe's gaze entered the courthouse carrying papers of their own. And Thomas Bennett's death was officially reopened. When Eliza finally stepped outside after giving another statement, Caleb was sitting on the courthouse steps. His shoulder had been properly stitched. His face was tired. She sat beside him. "You could have died." Caleb looked toward the mountains. "So could you." For a while they watched families enter and leave the courthouse carrying deeds, receipts, and old letters. Eliza finally said, "You changed everything." Caleb shook his head. "No, ma'am. You did. I just opened the door." Weeks later, when the snow began retreating from the lower slopes, Eliza walked toward the stable and saw Caleb tightening a bedroll behind his saddle. His Winchester was strapped in place. So were his traps. Everything about the horse said he was leaving. Eliza stopped several feet behind him. Caleb did not turn immediately. He had faced armed men more easily than he faced the sound of her footsteps. At last, Eliza asked a question he had been hoping she would not. Do you always leave when things start becoming important? Caleb kept one hand on the saddle strap. Mountains where I live. Eliza looked at the bedroll, the traps, and the Winchester tied behind the saddle. Everything was packed exactly as it had been before she entered his life. A man could make leaving look ordinary if he practiced long enough. I didn't ask where you live. Caleb finally turned. Eliza stepped closer. I asked if you always leave when things start becoming important. His eyes moved toward the mountains. Crow's finished. Harlan's talking. You've got half the town watching your back now. So you don't need me. Eliza's expression softened, and somehow that made the word harder for him to hear. You think I wanted you here because I needed a rifle? Caleb said nothing. You broke open that hunting cabin when you could have ridden past. You came back after Harlan shot you. You walked into that street, knowing you might not walk out again. She paused. But you're still treating this like you rescued me, and the job is over. Caleb looked down at the reins. My wife and daughter needed me once. There it was. Not the whole wound, just the part that had never healed. I wasn't there. Eliza, I came home to ashes. His voice was barely above a whisper. For years, Caleb had carried that sentence farther than any trapline or mountain trail. It had followed him into every winter, every empty supper, every night when the only sound inside his cabin was the stove settling after dark. Eliza reached for his good hand. Caleb almost pulled away. Almost. I can't promise you won't lose anyone again, she said. Nobody can. His fingers remained stiff beneath hers. But living alone doesn't protect the people you've already lost, and it doesn't honor them either. Caleb looked at her. She did not ask him to forget Sarah. She did not ask him to replace Annie. That mattered. Eliza squeezed his hand once. Stay, because you want somewhere to come home to. Caleb had faced blizzards that buried trails overnight.